Amen. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. So if you have a Bible with you, could you turn with me please to Amos chapter 6? And we're racing through. Past the halfway point. Tonight there's going to be plenty of reading for us all to do. So let's have a read around. Woe to you who are at ease in Zion and trust in Mount Samaria, notable persons in the chief nations to whom the house of Israel comes. Go over to Calneh and see. From there go to Hamath the great. Then go down to Gath of the Philistines. Are you better than these kingdoms, or is their territory greater than your territory? Woe to you who put far off the day of doom, who caused the seat of violence to come near. Verse 4.
You shall now go captive as the first of the captives, and those who recline at the banquets shall be moved. The Lord God has sworn by himself. The Lord God of hosts says, I abhor the pride of Jacob and hate his palaces. Therefore I will deliver up the city and all that is in it. Verse 9.
It shall come to pass, if there remain 10 men in one house, they shall die. And when a man's uncle shall take him up, feeling that he burneth him to bring out the bones out of the house, and shall say unto him that it is the innermost parts of the house, is there yet any of thee? And he shall say, No then. He shall say, Hold thy peace, we may not make mention of the name of Jehovah. For behold, Jehovah commanded that the great house shall be smitten with breaches, and that the little house with clefts. Verse 12.
Your horses run on rocks, as one plough with bear with oxen. Yet you have turned justice into gold, and the fruit of righteousness into wormwood. You who rejoice over the bar, who say, Have we not taken Carnaim for ourselves by our own strength? But behold, I will raise up a nation against you, the house of Israel, says the Lord God of hosts, and they will afflict you from the entrance of Hamath to the valley of Arabah.
Very good. So another cheery one, as we expect in the Minor Prophets, for us to have a look at. And just to remind us, in case we've forgotten, this time frame of Amos's prophecies are, of course, at the beginning of the time of King Jeroboam II. Amos prophesied to the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, talking to those who were worshipping specifically at the temple at Bethel. Now, the people whom he was talking to, what they represent as those in Israel whom we would class as true believers. Those people who truly believe the religion that they are a part of. The ones who truly believe that their worship, their sacrifices and their feast days, all of their religious piety, and even the temple at Bethel and Dan, is where you worshipped God, and Jerusalem was wrong. And they were right. And there's lots of religions around there where it's either them or it's us, it's either them or it's us. Now that's an important principle we understand where we start off, in particular what we're going to learn today. Because people who are that religious, in a sense, they have a conviction about their faith. Now, they're convicted entirely in the wrong faith, but they have a conviction. And sometimes that conviction in that faith, well, we see on the news, it can be to a great extent where somebody has that conviction that they'll strap a bomb to their chest and blow themselves up. And that's at the ultimate level of conviction and belief that what you believe is right, because there's no coming back from that whatsoever. And there are all different kinds of levels of conviction. These are the people we're talking about who would have that full level of conviction. Now, Bethel is one of these 2 religious centers set up by Jeroboam I. These temples have golden calves in them. And what we read is that Jeroboam the first created these religions based on the Mosaic covenant, but completely changed it by giving his own days, his own festivals, and his own priests. And what he was actually making was a counterfeit religion. This is the answer to those who say, well, my Jesus wouldn't do that. And we say, yes, I'm sure your Jesus wouldn't do that. But the Jesus of the Bible, the Jesus who is described in the Word of God, this is what he would do. Now, the reason Jeroboam did it is for one reason and one reason only. He wanted to keep power. There was no religious means or aims or any belief on his side. So if the people at Jeroboam II believed this is the one true God, the guy who set it up didn't. Now that speaks volumes, doesn't it, really? When the guy who set the religion up didn't believe it, but everybody who follows it does. And, you know, sometimes these things take a momentum of their own. And they talk about, you know, anthropologists talk about these religions and religious systems that set up. And sometimes you see on films, like film Men in Black, where they go into this, they open, and to those of you who've never seen the film, are wondering what I'm talking about. They go open this locker in a bus terminal, and in there there's this whole nation of little ant type furry creatures that are living, and they've made an entire religious system around a clock, a little timepiece, a little watch system. And it's this idea of people who make a whole faith system based on a guy who just wanted to keep hold of everything. And that isn't alone. I'm going to say this because I know we have to remember the Church of England didn't get born out of a revival. It got born out of a king who wanted to keep power, and his power was being challenged. And the difference is the Church of England actually had a revival later on in its life. It had its Westminster Confession moment, and it had that phrase. But it's another situation where people create a religion for no other means than to keep control of people. And this is why Karl Marx is famous for saying, and why Christians have a problem with Karl Marx, is because he said religion is the opiate of the masses. Now, if he was rewriting it today, he would say Strictly Come Dancing is the opiate of the masses. Or the X Factor is the opiate of the masses, because, you know, you could put that on and then do anything you want. People don't notice what's going on around them because they're all happy to talk about why John Sargent should be voted. Now, I really show him how long ago that. That's the last time I ever watched it, when John Sargent was on it. And when he didn't win it, I thought it was a travesty. Amos represents the poor. The oppression of the poor is listed so much in the Old Testament as a thing not to be. But the reason isn't to end poverty, but because the poor have no capacity to have a relationship with the Lord, because all of their life is simply dedicated to staying alive. And we're not talking about the poor as we might mean people who can only afford one set of Reebok trainers. We're talking about people who can't afford to eat, or can only just afford to eat. We're talking about a time, you know, in this country where you're talking the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where a couple of rashers of bacon fed a family. Dad got the bacon, the kids got the dripping, and Mum got the sweepings up. And there was a whole kind of calorie rationing going on because Dad would have had a physical job, either in an industrial set or down a mine. You're talking about that level of poverty where could they actually be kicked out of their house? Could we be living in Hyde Park tonight? Could it be any situation like that? And these kind of things were very common and very often would happen. And when people are in that position, they don't have any time to be spending with the Lord, and they certainly didn't have the money to be going and buying the sacrifices and all of the things that were required, so their poverty kept them out of the temple. Their poverty kept them away from God, and if any hardship came upon them, particularly in the name of the Lord, then the first person they're going to resent is God. And that's why God talks so regularly in the Old Testament about don't you do it. Because I don't have these people blaming me for their situation when you were the ones that have caused it and laid it upon them. So far we've seen in the book of Amos, it begins where Amos uses the nations around Israel who the religious at Bethel denounce for their behavior, including Jerusalem, where the true temple is. Amos wasn't there to warn those people of the surrounding nations. What he is doing, it's proverbially the three fingers pointing back. Whilst the people at Bethel pointed at Judah and all the other nations and said, look what these godless nations are doing, Amos said, well, look what you're doing, you godless nation. Back again. And gave them the same thing, the three crimes: a corrupt judiciary to abuse the poor, a disregard of God's gifts for what their own eyes wanted, and using the poor to try and get closer to their God in worship. The idea of using the poor. I've had this conversation with Christine before, and it's something that kind of bothers me quite a lot about churches around us, as they seem to have a very strong social conscience in terms of the works that they do, food banks, shelters, sex trafficking, urban slavery, all of these things that they want to kind of get heavily involved with, and yet they seem to have a heavily capitalist approach as a church. In other words, their politics doesn't seem to match their actions. And you'll be wondering, I don't know if I get what you're talking about now. So I will hold that back to you in a sense and say that I would expect people who genuinely have a real concern in a social sense to be very socialist in their beliefs and politics, but they aren't. They're the same group that will be going to Nando's after with the youth group. Well, that completely prices out, well, it prices me out for a start, but it prices a lot of people out, and certainly most young people. And you say to them, well, we're going Nando's after. Well, that's a 12 quid meal. How many young people are walking around with 12 quid in their pockets that they can just go, and then another 3 or 4 quid for a drink, and they want a dessert, but youth pass is gone, and they're all trendily dressed, and everyone has to drink coffee. It doesn't fit with the socialist responsibility, and what comes back with that is it's just exploitation. That's all it is. We want to feel better about ourselves. We want to feel like we are doing good works. We want to seem like we are approaching, but it isn't the poor we want, because they're not bringing tithes in. It's the middle class, the liberal middle class, who feel guilty about their wealth, and we'll help them feel guilty about their wealth and liberate them from that guilt with our new buckets. Bigger ones, bigger buckets to liberate the wealth. And that's the problem that comes in. These two things don't fit. There isn't a will that fits with the action. They're completely approaching it from a different way. Now, that is a real crime. Now, what Amos shows in chapter 3, that nothing happens by surprise. To those who are listening to God, they worshiped a golden calf. So when he mentions to them, well, you came out of Egypt, he's immediately pointing to the fact that, well, that's not the first time in history that Israel has worshipped a golden calf, and it went bad. And the real challenge to them is this: listen, open your eyes up, read your own history, look at your own religion, believe what's going on, even look at your own conviction and the fact that God keeps sending you prophets to tell you that you're wrong. Maybe. It's a joke I've heard, but it's a true one. They say if somebody calls you a horse, punch them in the face. If somebody else calls you a horse, you have a right to punch them in the face. But if 3 people call you a horse, maybe it's time to go out and buy a saddle. Because when you hear the same thing coming back and back and back, maybe there's a good possibility that it's true. It's either true or everybody hates you. And it could be that everybody hates you, or it's true. Therefore, you should always listen and listen in to those things. And listen and test. Don't let it destroy you, but test it. That's it. Yeah. Now, even those who are worshipping here truly believe that this is God, and the worship and the service is what the Lord wants. Everything is telling them that that's just not true. And therefore, the wrath of God is really justifiably poured out on them, because their own evidence points to the fact. But the twist that we learned is those who are actually worshipping at Bethel, this counterfeit religion, which suppresses and exploits the poor people, is created by the wealthy, but it's believed by the poor. It is the poor themselves who were sucked into these religions, who believe that they have to worship at them. Now, Amos is talking to those in his own position. He tells them, the horns that they cling to, where you would ask for mercy, there will be no mercy. There is no God at the end of this. You're worshipping the wrong one. So what do you do with that information if you're told the way that you have worshipped God, the place that you've worshipped God, the religion that you've been brought up in since a little child, that your mum and your grandparents have believed, and you have been taken along to whatever, and somebody turns around to you and tells you, there's no God in your religion. That isn't the Lord, and you hear that information. No, we live in a town where there are many religions and many gods. Are there gods in their religions? No. They're stone statues. They're ideas. They're suggestions made by men who wanted to control and now are believed many centuries down the line by millions, sometimes just thousands. But they are swallowed and hooked up into it, and to completely detach yourself from that. So if you were bought in this church, if you were born in this church, you came to this church, you were brought up in any kind of church, then it wasn't really that hard for you to disconnect from maybe the life that you lived. Maybe you were brought up in a secular household like I was. But I certainly wasn't given any hardship for going to church, other than the time when I came back with wet hair and my mum said, "What on earth has happened to you at church tonight?" I said, "Oh, I got baptised." And we had a long conversation about what that was. I mean, I wasn't sure myself, to be honest, but what just had happened. But this whole kind of process. But I can't say that I was held back. But we regularly know, and we often talk and we hear testimonies of people who are coming from other religions, Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, who have to flee their own families and maybe even flee the town that they are born in to go and hide, because to disassociate from that, it's a big step for anybody. And that's when you've got to ask yourself, is the Jesus that we are teaching, is the religion, the relationship that we are teaching, we might think of it as a simple and easy thing, because for many of us it was a simple and easy thing. It really didn't cost us much more than time. That when we teach it and preach it to certain people, it will cost them a lot more than time. A lot more than time. And yet, to not teach it and to not preach it and to not believe it means it will cost them a lot more than family. It will cost them their lives. It will cost them eternity. And that's when we start realizing we're not playing with anything here. We have a serious story on our hands, an important duty, a message that is greater than the cure for cancer. And it will cost people, and it could cost people. And we heard Sunday morning the cost of that encounter with the Lord. And we have to think about that. When people get that information, what do? Well, the cows of Bashan, Amos called them in chapter 4, in reference to the well-fed pasture of the Jordan region, represent a type of the false religion to come. The whore of Babylon, whom is the mystery religion. And in the book of Revelation, when John sees Babylon, he marvels. Because this well-seasoned Christian, this guy who knelt on Jesus' bosom on the night of his betrayal, even he who knew Christ intimately thought she was a good-looking woman, was stunned and taken in by her. This is why so many are taken in. This is why so many fall into these false religions. So Amos's challenge is, if you think you're not wrong, if you're convinced you've got it right, prepare to meet God. Take the test. Get ready to meet God face and tell him why he's wrong and you're right, if you dare. But of course, Amos's message is specific to those who see themselves as religious. Therefore, in chapter 5, we see and identify yet another group within this religious bracket. He addresses the religious who portray an attitude that divine judgment should be poured out without mercy on enemies. I'm sure we've all met somebody like that. They believe and they are looking forward to that day when the wrath of God will come down on people. Smite them, Lord, smite them hard. Yet knowingly, they know they're just as guilty. So they put this whitewashed tomb thing going on, but inside they've got the dead bones. How can people think like that? How can people genuinely think that I could call down thunder on other people when I'm just as bad a sinner? Well, the answer for them was their supreme confidence is they could call for the day of the Lord regardless of their own behavior, because they were seeking in the promises that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They simply figured they got God over a barrel. God has said to Isaac and to Jacob and to Abraham that we're going to inherit this land. It will be ours. We're going to come back from Egypt. It's ours. What can you do, God? You've got to keep your own words so we can do what we want. Just shut up and get on with it. Get rid of them. And when we have that arrogance and that nature about the Lord, then we better know that bad things are coming our way with regards to it. But imagine being at the altar, believing that you are worshipping God, but deciding that inside of you, you don't want to get to know him. You've no interest in getting to know God. You've just come to pay your dues and go home and have your Sunday roast. That's all you're interested in. You don't want to come and have a relationship. It seems crazy to us. And now we see, if those who are at Bethel are the poor, if those who are at Bethel are the poor, and yes, they're being duped, they're not innocent either. They're not innocent either, because they're choosing not to get to know God. And why are they choosing not to get to know God? Because if they got to know him, then they know that they would have to change. If they got to know him, then they know that the things that they believe would be proved not to be true. They know that the difference would come upon them. And so it's just easier to not to get to know God, because that way I can carry on doing what I know I shouldn't be doing, or I want to carry on doing. It's just easier to call down judgment on those who are oppressing me than actually deal with the situation myself. And we see this dark humor that they jump from a lion and find a bear. They go safe behind a wall in a house and get bitten by a snake. Proverbially, they jump out of the frying pan and into the fire. And the Lord reveals what he thinks of their worship when it's designed to get and move God. He hates it. If you think you can move God with your worship, you can bribe him, you can convince him, you can twist his arm, or you can tickle his ears and get him to do what you want, then you are wrong. And it contrasts it and answers why the promises of Bethel, Gilgal, and Beersheba are no refuge. Those promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because they were avoiding a relationship with God. And when you avoid that, it's just like the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt. They refused to have a relationship with God. You go for us, Moses. We don't want to do it. We're too afraid. It's scary. God's scary. You go. And he came down with a shining face. Put something over your face. We don't want to see that. We don't want to see the glory of God. We just want to get on with it, get our manner, and carry on with our walking around here. And they didn't get the promises either. So if they reject a relationship with Jesus and didn't get the promises, then you can better believe that if we reject a relationship with the Lord, we won't get the promises either. Because when we don't know the Lord, then we don't know what the Lord wants. And when we don't know what the Lord wants, we will do the wrong thing and make the wrong choices. And in fact, the Lord said, your worship to me is just like when they put their children in the fire to Moloch. That's how your worship comes across to me when you don't want to have a relationship. When you give the glory and say, oh Lord, you're wonderful, you're beautiful, you're amazing, you're awesome, but you don't want to have a relationship with me. It's ridiculous. And that's how God sees their worship. It's an abomination. And that takes us now into this chapter. Because we might not realize this, but even though we're only looking at chapter 6, which is really only one chapter past the halfway point, Amos is actually now forming his conclusion. This is the end of the prophecy God has given to him. In chapter 7, we get the very last point of that, then this historical interlude, and the last two chapters are an epilogue about the basket of summer fruit, reinforcing the point. So today, we're really coming to the conclusion of what's actually happened to those who don't listen to warnings and come out of the nation of Israel, come out of this false religion of Jeroboam, who remain in it. What will happen to them? So today, when we're looking at this, we have to know that like all good conclusions, there's no real new information. There's a little bit, but not much. What it is, it's a pulling together of all the things that we've already understood. And that's why there's a lot of sentences in this that sound familiar to us, because we've already looked at them. But who is the chapter's message directed at? Well, it's another religious group here. And it's a message which is one we can find throughout the Bible. One which Hosea taught was a reason for ending unbelief, and one which we even saw last week is a reason for people choosing not to have a relationship with the Lord. And it's all contained in this very first verse. The very first verse, it says, "Woe to you who are at ease in Zion and trust in Mount Samaria, notable persons in the chief nations to whom the house of Israel comes." So who is it? Who's this religious group? Complacent. And that's an interesting word. What instead of ease? Has everybody else got ease? Has anybody got anything different to ease? Now, we will come back to that in a moment, and that's a good and interesting point. Have you ever heard the phrase, "Woe to those who are at ease at Zion"? Now, this is the only place it is in the Bible, but it is. If anyone's ever read Pilgrim's Progress, when Christian escapes out of Vanity Fair, he goes to a place where he goes to recuperate because he's been beaten and all of the things that are there. And he says at the end of it, "And I was at ease in Zion." When they leave, he leaves and makes a huge mistake and decides to come off the King's Highway because the road is too hard and they want to walk on the field for a while. And they get lost in the field and they end in the castle of the giant Despair. So you can understand that phrase, "Woe to those who are at ease in Zion," because it ends in a disastrous place. And that phrase, being at ease, everything's good, life's good, is the minute a car crashes into you. And that kind of phrase and understanding. And it's something you come across as a theme a lot in the Bible, just not that exact wording. It actually happens a lot. So we'll come to that, but there are four elements that make up this group of people from that first verse. First of all, they're at ease in Zion. Secondly, they trust in the mountain of Samaria. Thirdly, the reason they do is because Samaria is the leader of all the nations. And fourthly, because everybody else is following them as well. So what do each of these things mean? Well, let's start with the last three. They trust in the mountain of Samaria. The reason they do is because Samaria is the leader of the nations and all the rest of Israel follow them. The mountain of Samaria has a very clear meaning to us, and right off the bat, what we know is it isn't a religious one. Because where's the religious center of the northern kingdom? Or centers? Which is an oxymoron because you can't have two centers. Bethel and Dan, not Samaria. So Samaria isn't where they go for religion. Samaria is something completely different. But we read something interesting in John chapter 4 about the mountain of Samaria. Even though it's not a religious center, what does John 4:19 to 22 say?
Abraham said, "You must be a prophet, so tell me, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is another place to worship, while we Samaritans claim that it is here at Mount Gerizim, where our ancestors worshipped?"
So here's something that's interesting. It's not a religious center. We've seen this in the northern kingdom. Bethel and Dan is where people go for religion. That's why Amos is there. Yet, in history, the Samaritan woman whom Jesus speaks to at the well seems to think the mountain of Samaria is a religious center. So it gives us an indication here something religious is here, but not the religion we've been looking at. What is going on? What's religious about this mountain? So what is Samaria? Well, let's have a look at a couple of verses. So turn with me to 1 Kings 16 and let's stay in it. And let's have a look at verses 23 and 24. 1 Kings 16, 23 to 24.
In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri became king of Israel, and reigned for 12 years, 6 of them in Tirzah. He bought the hill of Samaria from Sheep
So it becomes the new head or capital of the northern kingdoms. So Samaria is the capital. Now stay in 1 Kings 16, don't turn out. Now that's something we've previously seen. It's something we looked at in Hosea. It's something we've already looked at in Amos. But as interesting as that isn't the reason for it being mentioned. It's not that it's the capital. It's because of who comes next and what he did. So turn to verse 28 of 1 Kings 16. And let's read 28 to 33. Who comes next after Omri?
Along the rest of the mythology included in Samaria, and Ahab the son of Amos place. In the 13th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab the son of Omri became king over Israel. And Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. Now Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. And it came to pass, as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. That's who took his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethel, king of the Sidonians, and went to and served Baal and worshipped him. Then he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. And Ahab made a wooden image. Ahab did not provoke the God of Israel to anger, and all the kings of Israel who were before him.
So now you see why it became a religious centre. Just not a religious centre of the worship of God, but a religious centre of the worship of Baal. And something new came into Israel that wasn't what Jeroboam created. Jeroboam created his own version of Judaism. But this isn't a version of Judaism. This is a completely different religion altogether. Baal is another god. But there is something counterfeit about it. I know I've said this a lot of times. The English translation of Baal is Lord. The English translation of Jehovah is Lord. Two lords. And Elijah asks the question, which one is he? Which one's Lord? Is it Baal or is it Jehovah? Who's Lord in your life? You can't have them both. It's got to be one or the other. Now that was the challenge under Elijah's Reformation period in the northern kingdom. But now Elijah and Elisha are dead. Now we're further on in history. And now we see something. It isn't that new though. But what happened for the first time is Baal worship was sanctioned by the ruling elite. The kings of Samaria didn't worship at Bethel. They didn't worship at Dan. They worshipped in Samaria. And they didn't worship God. They worshipped Baal. Jeroboam had set up cars and declared them as God, which brought them out of Egypt. They were false altars and false representations of the Lord. But they were an attempt at a worship of the one true God, as evil as it was. Under Ahab and through his wife, the worship of Baal became an official religion of Israel. They now had two official religions. And they were both recognized. The prophet of the Lord were persecuted and killed by the prophets of Baal and by Jezebel. And the worship of Baal was the religion of the king. Now, up until this point, who have we been talking about in Bethel? Who is it that Amos is prophesying to? Religious zealots. People who are full-on believers. People who genuinely believe these cows are the ones that brought them out of Egypt. Why on earth have they tolerated a second religion in their nation? How have they come to allow the kings of their own nation, why haven't they split off and become the third nation of Israel? And said, no, we're not having that. We're not having Baal worship come into our great nation. We are worshippers of God. We worship at Bethel and we worship at Dan. They're pointing the finger at Judah and saying, you guys aren't keeping the law, but we worship God correctly. Except for my king worships a different God. The ruling elite, the people who are actually in charge and in control, they don't believe in God. Only we poor believe in God. Why have they not risen up and had their own civil war? Why have they accepted it? Why have they gone along with it? It's an interesting point that comes out to us that really now starts to open up a lot to us. And the answer is because of reasons 3 and 4. Because the king of the mountain of Samaria, what was he bringing? Well, he was in charge of the nations. He was powerful. He brought glory to the nation. And everybody else followed him. Have a look at 2 Kings 14 and verses 23 to 29. We've looked at it lots of times, but let's just remind ourselves what Jeroboam II and what it actually looked like to live in Israel at this time. 2 Kings, make sure you're in number 2. 2 Kings 14, 23 to 29. Yes, please.
As for the other events of Jeroboam's reign, all the years his military achievements include having recovered from Israel both Damascus and Hamath, which belonged to Judah. Are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Israel? Jeroboam rested with his ancestors, the king of Israel, and Zechariah his son, succeeded him as king.
So what we know is great wealth, glory, came back to the nation. They had the same land boundary that Solomon had. They were never as big as this ever again. They got the whole lot back. They were the powerful nation. All the surrounding nations paid them tribute, were scared and terrified of them. If you can remember when we looked at Amos 1 and 2, the very idea that these nations could rise up against them seemed as crazy as saying the Isle of Wight are going to take us out in 10 years. They're going to rise up, everybody. Fear the Manxmen. They're coming. And all of that kind of thing is they saw it ridiculous, a ridiculous idea completely. And they were powerful and they were doing really well. This king was successful. So why would they accepting this Baal worship? Well, today young people at school, salesmen in work environments and self-help books, guide society, surround themselves with successful people. You are taught constantly, hang around with the successful ones. I remember being in a sales job and talking to a lad, and my team manager came up to me and said, don't talk to him, he gets less sales than you. Go and talk to somebody else. Go and talk to somebody who gets more sales than you. I thought, well, he'd be talking to somebody who gets less sales than him. Somebody's got to do it. This doesn't make any sense to me. But the fact is they are taught that they must surround themselves with successful people. It's all over. You see it on the TV, you'll see it, and you'll hear it in churches. Surround yourself with successful people. Learn from them. Let them and let their successful habits rub off on you, and you do what they do. But this isn't new thinking. This isn't 21st century thinking. As much as many of these self-help gurus would like to think that they've come up with the idea, it's as old as the Bible is itself. Because here we are seeing it again. Why are they putting up with it? Because he's successful. Because he's winning. Fans love the manager of a football team when he's winning. And when he's losing, even though he may have won for the last 15 years, he's losing now, he's terrible. Worst manager ever. Hasn't got a clue what he's doing. And they'll soon have the banners out, and they'll be out on the stadium. We want him out, we want him out. successful people. However, the cost of surrounding yourself with successful people and letting their habits rub off on you is, what if their habits aren't godly ones? What if their nature of success isn't something that is godly, that is goodly, that is something that the Lord would approve of? What if they are dishonest means to become successful? And on this subject of compromise, Hosea has already taught us. The wound could never be healed whilst this connection with Baal always remained. It didn't matter how successful they were. They would always slip away from the Lord whilst the Baal worship was still going on. They would always be drawn back to it. But of course, the irony of all this compromise and following these habits was, it wasn't either Baal or the king who provided the results. It was the Lord who worked through Jeroboam. It was God who actually took pity on them. It was God who gave them these extra boundaries. It was the Lord who gave them the lot, and they didn't give him a single jot of recognition for it. It wasn't God who did it. It was Jeroboam, and we're going to worship Jeroboam, and we're going to follow Jeroboam. Jeroboam can do what he wants because he keeps getting us stuff. And it was the Lord through Jeroboam that saved them. What looks like success and where it comes from, we must be very careful, and we must carefully consider it before we take on these ideas. Well, this church is doing such and such, and it seems to be working for them. Well, where's it come from? What's the compromised nature of it? Is it really a successful idea, or have they had to sell their soul to be able to get there? And of course, the last reason, well, everybody else is following him, is the worst reason ever. As my mother used to always say, if everyone was jumping off a cliff, would you jump off a cliff too? And if I wasn't in arm's reach, the answer that would come back is, yes, I would. And then I'd bolt through the door. You see, we have to understand something. In the Bible, the majority are usually always wrong. The 10 tribes were wrong. Only Judah was right. The 10 spies were wrong. Only Joshua and Caleb were right. Korah and Dathan and their sons were wrong. Only Moses and Aaron were right. All the leaders of Israel at the time of Jesus were wrong. Only the 12 disciples were right. It isn't about what the majority want, but what the Word of God teaches. And if we are drawn by the majority because everybody else is doing it, well, everybody else is doing it, so it's okay, then we're just all heedlessly going down the wrong way. Remember, the way to the Lord is a narrow way, and few find it. But the way of destruction is broad, and everybody's on that road. And yet what Amos 6:1 tells us about this religious group is, they don't tolerate Samaria, the mountain of Samaria, because it's been bringing success and because everyone else follows them. What it says is, they trust in their leadership. Now the word for trust here in the Hebrew is botark, and it means to be secure and in a place of refuge. Now it doesn't mean a place of refuge you flee to. It means a place of refuge. You found yourself in this situation, and now I'm going to find myself safe in it. And now the absolute hypocrisy is revealed to us. These true believers, these ones who absolutely believe that these cows are God, whom Amos has been sent to, the hypocrisy of them is revealed to us. They may be poor, following the religion set up by the wealthy to keep in power. They may have been duped into believing it. But Amos has showed us through all of these chapters, through Israel's history, through their own conviction, through what their own eyes were showing them, that there have been many prophets telling them that this isn't God. This isn't the one that brought them out of Egypt. We've seen that they've actually physically chosen not to have a relationship so that they don't have to ask those questions. We've seen that they've chosen clearly that they don't want to get to know God. And now we learn that for all their zeal, for all their passion of the cows that are here at Bethel and at Dan, they're not very zealous at all. They're willing to embrace anything and any other practice, and they will put their utter trust in it. Hang on a second. I thought these were your gods. You're going to trust in Baal as well? You're going to trust in people who believe in other? Yeah, I am. Because it's bringing me what I need and what I want. If there was ever a question in your mind of the fairness of the judgment on those who thought they were worshipping God but weren't, then Amos, I hope, has taught you otherwise. These people who are caught up in the Catholic Church, who are caught up in the Mormons, who are caught up in the Jehovah's Witnesses, who are caught up in Islam, it is a sad, sad fact that they are caught up in it, that they may have been duped in it, that they may have been brought up in it. But their eyes are teaching them that it's not real, and they're ignoring them. Their heart is telling them it isn't real, and they're ignoring it. Their own religious books are telling them that it's wrong. Their own religion is telling them that there's nothing in this. And the fact is, if they're so zealous for it, why aren't they defensive of it? And they aren't. They'll support every other religion going that will bring them that success, that will help them with it. But regardless if you think that then those who are listening to Amos couldn't have walked away with any other conclusion. The whole thing is made worse by this statement that is coupled to this trust in Samaria, they being at ease in Zion. That phrase really provides us with a contradiction completely. Now it's a phrase, it's one we need to listen to apply to ourselves. Because throughout the Bible you'll see variations of that as a statement that those who are being at ease then fall into judgment. Fall into the wrath of God, They fall foul. They find themselves, everything is good and then it isn't. Think about the parable of the steward. And he thinks the master isn't coming, so he starts beating the other stewards. He's lazy and he's a glutton. And then all of a sudden the master comes back. And it's all about the suddenness. That's why it's a woe. I'm ease, I'm relaxing. Oh, the boss is here. And I should be out in the field. As the phrase goes, Jesus is coming back. Everybody look busy. But it's not look busy, it's be busy. So no matter how hard you try it, you've got to. You've got to work hard with it. See, to the people Amos was talking to, this statement's a little confusing. Zion isn't found in Israel, it's found in Jerusalem. So what is Zion? We're going to look at a couple of scriptures to reveal it to us. First of all, let's turn to 1 Kings 8:1, which is the first mention of cannibalism in the Bible. I took you a while to get that, 1 Kings 8:1. I know 2 Kings 8:1 is a different, but 1 Kings 8:1. There you go. I've seen who's awake, to be honest. 1 Kings 8:1. What is Zion?
Solomon never summoned to Jerusalem the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the ancestral families of the Israelites. They were to bring the ark of the Lord's covenant to the temple into location in the city of David, also known as Zion.
It's a title that is connected to Jerusalem once David had conquered the place. Once David had conquered it and made it his capital city, now Jerusalem isn't in Judah, it's in Benjamin. And he thought that important so that there was a note there that the Judean king was in Benjamin, was in the tribe of Benjamin, particularly because Saul himself was a Benjamite first, the first king of Israel. So Jerusalem is called Zion when it's in connection with David. Now that gives us an important eschatological teaching here, an end times point, because it's referred to as the city of David because That's where the king of all Israel will sit, whom its descendant, its last king, will rule there. And this, of course, is Jesus in the millennial reign. So that's an important seat of government. But the 10 tribes have already rejected that kingly line. How can they put both their trust in Zion and Samaria? That's a contradiction. It doesn't make sense. You can't, this is our king and that's our king. It doesn't make any sense. You can only have one. Well, after David, in the age of the prophets, and remember the prophets weren't through the whole period of the kings. The prophets began at the time of Jeroboam II and Uzziah of Judah. And in that time period, it gains a different meaning. Now turn to Isaiah 8 and verse 18. So what does Zion mean now? Isaiah 8:18. Who dwells on Mount Zion. So this now is considered a dwelling place, and it's now the reference not to the city of Jerusalem, but to a mountain. And this time it's referring to the Temple Mount, where the temple is kept. But again, the 10 tribes have rejected that temple. They've got their own. So what's going on here? How can you have Zion and Samaria? It's a contradiction. You either believe in one or you believe in the other. And if you believe in one, what on earth are you doing living in Samaria? And if you believe in Samaria, what on earth are you doing living in Judah? You've got to make a decision. One or the other is right. Pick one or the other. Well, we as a church really should be able to understand this more than most, because one of our former names was Zion. This church originally was called Zion. Zion Chapel, Zion Pentecostal Church have been its titles, but Zion, and even some of the road signs around here still say Zion. And people come and go, "You don't know where Zion Chapel is, do you?" And I go, "No, I've no clue, I'm sorry." Are you a bailiff? It took me 3 years to disconnect to the right gas company because Zion was still sitting over the flat. And even now, if you put it into any of those postcode finders, it's 2 Lower Ashworth, flat 2 Lower Ashworth, flat 2 Zion Pentecostal Church, Lower Ashworth. They're all the same address. And they all come up on the same time. You see, Zion, we understand it because, well, let me ask you the question. Is Blackburn the seat of the temple? Is this where the temple is to be rebuilt? No. And in case anybody was hoping for that, no, it's not. Blackburn is not going to be the center. That song, Jerusalem, did these ancient feet once sit on? No, they didn't. Never. Of course it isn't. So turn with me to Hebrews 12, and let's have a look at verses 18 to 24. Let's try and understand this phrase, Zion. And for Andrew, who is worrying that it's 9:15 and we haven't got past verse 1 yet. Don't worry, Andrew. Hebrews 12, 18 to 24. So when you all accepted Jesus as Savior, you all came to Mount Zion. Did anyone fly off to Jerusalem when they accepted the Lord as Savior? No? Not been? There isn't even a temple there now, so it would have been a waste of time There is, but it's just not the right one. The fact is that it is a spiritual place. We are the city. We know that Revelation 21 tells us, because I use it all the time, if you want it for your notes, Revelation 21, 9-10 tells you that when the angel asked John if he wanted to see the Lamb's wife, the bride, he takes him and he sees the city, Jerusalem. Because we are that city. We are buildings of God. We are building on one another. Jesus is the foundation. We're all different shaped buildings, different size, different makeups. And other people are building on us. We're not building on us. And Jesus is the architect, and he tells us when to and who to build on and how to build on them. This is our calling to one another. That's how we carry on. So wherever you are, the kingdom and the city of heaven is. This isn't a New Testament idea. It's a kingdom principle. It goes through the whole of the Bible. Amos listeners, you might think, well, how does that apply to Amos, his listeners? Well, the answer is they thought themselves the true worshippers of the Lord. And we know that from what we read in Amos 2. Just look at Amos 2, 4 and 5. What are they saying to Judah? Amos 2, 4 to 5. Now, of course, it's the Lord that said that, but he's saying that because that's what the people at Bethel think. Yeah, look at them over there. They think they're so godly. We're God's chosen people. You're supposed to judge them, God. You need to pour down your wrath on them. You need to turn it on them because all the bad things that those people with the temple are doing, we're the only ones that truly believe in you and worship you. So therefore, we're the people of Zion. It isn't that the Lord thinks that they're the people of Zion, it's that they think that they're the people of Zion. They don't think Judah are the people of Zion, they think they're the people of Zion. They're the true believers. They're the ones who've got it right. Yet what we've seen is they couldn't be further from the truth. Their own eyes should be telling them that they've got this completely wrong. And in fact, for them to come to this suggestion and idea that they are carrying the kingdom of heaven around with them wherever they go, they are fully blessed by God, even though that they have chosen not to have a relationship with God, to believe that God is, they are his and they are Zion, means that they have got to have some major blinkers on to be absolutely ignoring the plain truth in front of them, that they are nothing of the sort. But they've come to the conclusion that they're God's people, even though their entire life proves that's just not true. How can they think they're the heavenly city when everything that they do is completely in opposition to the book and the word of God? And that's exactly why Amos tells them woe. Because that blinker that they've got on is the word at ease. Being at ease isn't wrong. You are not supposed to be like a cat at a statened, terrified, anything's going to pounce at me any moment. I'm walking down the street. Oh no, look at that. I'm not going to heaven anymore. And how many Christians do you know have got that kind of lack of faith and conviction in the salvation that Jesus has bought them, that they had one too many biscuits this morning at 11's, and now they are destined for hell. There is no place for them anymore in the kingdom of heaven because they've had too many bourbon creams. They have been a glutton. Or they've allowed a bad word to come out of their mouth. Or they've looked at something they shouldn't have looked. Friends, we've all, I'm going to use an absolute, but we've all at times told ourselves, I can't be going to heaven. I do this. I can't be going to heaven. I've done that. And the devil will very helpfully remind us of all these things as well and say, what are you doing in here? You shouldn't be in here. Look at all these things that you've done. So you get these Christians who they feel like, well, I've got to be constantly on guard, constantly all the time on edge. I can't feel at ease. And that isn't what is wrong. It isn't a command that we should have no confidence in our salvation, because it isn't salvation we've bought. It's salvation that's been bought for us by somebody who could do it. It isn't based on you. You didn't save yourself, and therefore you can't keep yourself saved. That isn't the case and the way it works. That wasn't where these people listening to Amos' trust was. You see, the thing is your confidence and trust should be in the one who provides you with salvation. But their trust was in the king of Samaria and his Baal worship, not in God at all. They didn't trust God. They didn't believe God was doing anything for them, even though they were the one true religion, and even though they were the Zion and the heavenly city. They didn't really trust God. They trusted the king instead. They trusted their leader. They trusted him to guide them their way. There are 3 words for being at ease in Hebrew. The first one is shuran. That means to be quiet, restful, and peaceful. Do you think that that's something that as Christians you shouldn't be? Kind of hope not, don't you? You are more than welcome to be quiet and restful. Please do that. It's good for you. The second word is shalanon, and that means to be tranquil. So to be tranquil. Now, think about Paul and Silas, covered in blood, beaten half to death, worshipping God, and all of those prisoners around them thinking, hey, these guys could carry a tune. And wondering what's going on, because they had an absolute tranquility over them. They were in utter peace, in utter chaos, because God was with them. That's the right kind. But the word that is here is sha'anon, and it means to be pridefully arrogant. Woe to those who are full of pride and arrogance, that they are the people of God. And this takes us all through what we've seen. Their belief that no nation could ever come against them because they're wealthy and because of their might. The suggestion that because of the covenants at Bethel and Beersheba and Gilgal, God had to protect them. What could ever happen to them? And this final conclusion, which we read here in Amos 6:13. You who rejoice over nothing, who say we have taken horns for ourselves by our own strength. Now, if you've got Lo Debar and Karnaim, your Bible probably has got a little letter by it and tells you down that the translation is literally nothing and literally horns. You who rejoice in nothing at all. There's nothing behind it. It's just it's just a puppet. As Brian Connolly used to say, it's just a puppet. There's nothing there. There's no God at the end of this. You who are rejoicing in nothing at all. You actually arrogantly trust and rejoice in nothing at all. And you make your own horns, means you've made your own power base. You've made your own right to rule. This is what you trust in. Now, these are the deadly last words that anybody will utter before a fall. Just have a look at Daniel 4:4. We'll read somebody who just about accidentally utters them. Daniel 4:4. I was living in comfort and prosperity. And the next thing you know, I'm mooing like a cow for 7 years. And eating the grass and letting the dew rest on my back, and nobody could come near me. Prideful arrogance. Shah and Orn. Or more pointedly, let's look at the New Testament. 1 Thessalonians 5, 2-5. 1 Thessalonians 5, 2-5.
For you know quite well that the day of the Lord will come unexpectedly like a thief in the night. When people say everything is peaceful, secure, then disaster will fall them. Suddenly, a pregnant woman in labour's pain, there will be no escape. But you aren't in the dark about these things, dear brothers and sisters. You won't be surprised when you go through all things like this. For you're all children of the light and of the day. You don't belong to darkness.
So we saw this on Sunday night with the angel of death. All of a sudden, everybody's fine. The next thing you know, you're waking up and your firstborn's dead. It's this line over and over again. The ease, the peace, safety. The prophets at the time of Jeremiah saying, no, Lord is going to fight for us and he's going to bring us back from Babylon. And Jeremiah is saying, no, he isn't. You guys are dead men. But in 70 years, God will bring somebody back. It'll only be a remnant, but he will bring them back. And he will start and build again and start to create the plan he always had from Genesis 3:15. The ease, the peace, the quiet. And yet, what does 2 Peter 3:5 say about those? Because if they're in darkness, then it means their darkness is their arrogance. Their arrogant phrase, nothing will ever happen. Sorry, 6:3-5. Sorry, 2 Peter 3:3-5.
Most importantly, I want to remind you, when the last day scoffers will come down on the truth and following their own desires. They will say, what happened to the promise that Jesus is going to be again? From before the time of our ancestors, everything has remained the same since the world was created. It is little to forget that God had made the heavens long ago by the word of his commandment, and he brought the earth out of the water that surrounded it with water.
Everything carries on like it'll always carry on. Nothing's ever going to happen. Nothing's ever going to happen. You guys are crazy. Can't believe that you think this stuff is going. You don't really believe Jesus is coming back, do you? And these are the same words you read then in Amos 6:3. Woe to you who put far off the day of doom. It's never coming. God isn't going to do anything. He's never going to do anything about it. He's never going to deal with the situation. Nothing's ever going to happen. Woe to those who are that kind of prideful arrogance, that kind of situation. And in those whom Amos concludes to a message of destruction, they have arrogantly presumed they are God's chosen, so nothing will befall them. Yet they trust in the successful kings and their godless practices because it's made them safe and secure. Everybody else is. So I'm following the crowd, and if everybody believes it, then maybe we're all right. Safety in numbers and all of that. Yet, in a nation under such security, in such prosperity, they're still poor. Everybody else is rich. And you can't feed your kids. But you're putting all your trust in that king. Yet it's not trickling down to you. It's not found you. But don't you say anything. What did he say? Yeah. Behave. We're non-political here. In a nation under such security and prosperity, they're still poor. They're still exploited. They're still in dire and desperate need. And who's causing that? The ones they're putting their trust in. They're the ones that are actually causing it, and they're the ones that they're believing to save them, and yet they're the ones that are actually causing them harm, and they're denying God, and they're not trusting in God, they're trusting in... It's like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. Now, promise you won't eat any. I'll have none of them. For the folly of this religious group, it's that they follow after a religion which was set up by a man to remain in power and hope that somehow they'll find God in it. But it isn't God they're looking for. It's a leader that they're looking for. It's someone to bring success to them regardless of the cost. They're looking for a king. And when Israel cried out for a king, that's exactly what Samuel told the nation they would do. And they said, no, we want a king. It's in 1 Samuel 8. You read it in that whole chapter. They come. Samuel's sons are not good men. They can't judge, so they come and say, we want a king like the other nations have got. He can make our decisions. He can go to God for us. That's why we read something that we don't read in the New Testament. In the New Testament, we read about people, ordinary people, having a relationship with God, with Jesus. In the Old Testament, we only read about kings and notable people having a relationship with God because everybody else completely obfuscated responsibility and gave it to them. You do it for us. That's why they're so like sheep. There's a good king, we'll all be good. Oh, there's a bad king, we'll all be bad. Now there's a good king and we'll all be good now. There's only one occasion that they actually end up being bad when the king is good. But there's no occasion where they're good when the king is bad. Of course, there's always an exception to the rule. There's always the odd prophet. There's always an Amos. There's always somebody who's willing, like an Elijah and Elisha, somebody who comes from nowhere and does something. But they're far and far between. The general people have completely obfuscated all personal responsibility. You tell me. You direct me. You lead me. You make my decisions for me. It is something that is so common that we've seen it in our own modern history. I'd spent years looking at the Third Reich. One man. People obfuscated personal responsibility. The only nation that did not resist was Germany. There was no resistance movement within the German nation during the Second World War. There was in every other nation, including all the ones that were part of the Axis. Even in Japan, there was a resistance movement. And they were fanatical. But not in Germany. Because people look for that responsibility. Somebody. Let's be the man. Follow him. Follow him. And you do see it a lot. You see it on Facebook. You see it all over. Lots of Christians do it. The leader, the pastor, the person. And I know when I did it, I would go everywhere to hear this one guy preach all the time. I thought he was brilliant. Thought he was amazing. Everything he did, every word that came out of his mouth was manna from heaven to me. And I wanted to be wherever he was because I thought he was just everything. There was Jesus and then there was him. And of course, I got to know him and realized that was just not true at all. He was a regular, everyday, normal guy that made mistakes. Dented my faith for a while. But it was my fault, not his. He never tried to be that. But then there are those who try to be that. They try to be everything to everybody. They try to live up to their own hype, but it's just hype. And none of us are Jesus. And none of us can be like that. And so, in the hearing of the poor who put their trust in immoral kings, Amos now denounces their actions. He's denouncing the actions of these rich and elite. But not so that the rich feel convicted. They're not even there. They're not listening. He's still helping those who are around to try and come to their senses. Look around you. there's nothing in this. You're crazy if you keep going down this road. So these are what he shows. Firstly, in verse 2. So we moved off verse 1 now, you'll be happy. Verse 2, 3 places are mentioned. Calneh, Hamath, and Gath. Calneh is only mentioned in Genesis 10:10. It's one of the cities of Nimrod. Nimrod builds the Tower of Babel in Calneh on the plain of Shinar. This great and powerful, mighty man. And through what God does at Babel, the confusion that he brings, the nation is brought low. When all mankind tried to stand against God and build a waterproof tower in case he tries to flood the earth again, so that they'll all be safe, God confuses the language. Was that not a great nation? If I could do that to Nimrod, why can't I do that to you, Israel? Hamath was of Syria. Who captured Syria? Jeroboam the second, this king. So if you could do that to them, why can't I do that to you? And Gath of Philistine, that's where Goliath comes from. The Philistines constantly, the little needle, still today, in their side. If I could do that to them, why can't I do that to you? 3 powerful nations, all captured and destroyed. Where is your belief? It came out of the blue, out of nowhere. They were building, and then all of a sudden, the word for please pass me that brick said, your mother is a warthog. And they started to fight. You was a bit slow with that, then, weren't you? Get it on. In verse 3, we read, it's the leaders you put your trust in that project the idea that judgment can't come, but it's their actions that will actually bring that day of judgment in. And then in verse 4, we read that they live in luxury. What we read is they eat the best. They're eating from the fattest. You've got nothing. By the way, you've had nothing. You've been eating that same stale piece of bread all week. They're having sheep tonight. They're having mutton. They're having beef. They're having sirloin. They're not just having sirloin. The dog's having sirloin. You're eating stale bread. They're the ones you're putting your trust in. They live on beds made out of ivory. It's not even strong enough for them to lie in. They're breaking them every night. They don't care. They've got the money. And yet, what they are consuming are the sacrificial animals that they are demanding that the poor give to God. Well, it's fine because the rich are giving them to God as well. We're all equal in our worship. We should all bring our own sheep. Fair enough, that's the only sheep you've got, and I've got 200,000 of them, because the Bible doesn't teach equality, it teaches equity. It teaches fairness based on situation. In verse 5, and this one's really close to home, I'm going to read this to you. Who sing idly to the sound of stringed instruments and invent for yourselves musical instruments like David. That word sing idly, it's a word called porat. It means they chant, and the word actually means impoverished prattle or scattered words. That sounds very much like, yeah, it does, doesn't it? Very much like speaking in tongues, that does. Do you know that worship is the easiest thing to fake in church? If all you want out of your leader is somebody who can worship God, then put a proper show on if you want. They can weep and they can wail and they can throw themselves. They can be quiet and they can raise their hands. Can't raise my hands now. God isn't striking me down. And yes, people can mock speaking in tongues. I had a pastor whose 4-year-old daughter, because they're from a Jamaican family. He's not, he's as white as a milk bottle, but they're from a Jamaican family. And she used to mock her granddad something chronic. It was hilarious, to be honest. So whenever he came to our church, she would stand behind him and she would say everything he said, she would say right behind him and like that. And she would really kind of, it's funny now because she's an 18-year-old girl who's just graduated from university, and she loves her granddad. But to her, she just thought that's what you do. She didn't know that it was meant to be a gift of the Holy Spirit. So she was doing that all the time. And so there was that kind of mocking. If what you want from leaders is an example of, well, you don't have to watch the American elections. Both sides will tell you that they love God and they worship God and they go to church. Yet their own actions prove that they don't necessarily believe that. The Christian ones in power now. Exactly. He's the God choice, apparently. And makes you wonder about the other one, doesn't it, really? And there you go. It's the easiest thing to do. So what do? Well, they speak these prattle, these impoverished, these scattered words, but they do it to music, to harp music. Harp music is sweet and melodic. It's a melodic sound. So it's a lovely sounding, hair-tingling kind of moment that they are raising here. What is he saying? He's saying, look, these leaders that you're looking at, these ones that you were believing, the only thing that they do that's remotely spiritual is they write songs. They make instruments. They talk about worship all the time. They're constantly going on about worship, but let me tell you something that's true. There's nothing wrong with speaking in tongues. There's nothing wrong with writing new worship songs. There's nothing wrong with glorifying God. Except that's all these guys do. They don't teach, they don't instruct, they don't serve, they don't rebuke, they don't challenge, they don't love. They just keep writing worship songs. It's just worship all the time. It's all about worship. Praying, reading your Bible to know Jesus and worshiping is how we build a relationship with the Lord. Simple as that. If you have to be told every Sunday, come on friends, we need to get off our chairs and worship God, then you need to understand this. Something my dad used to say to me all the time. Breathe in, breathe out, don't forget it, it'll save your life. Because these things should be as natural to us as breathing. An infant comes out of the womb, it gets its backside smacked, and it tells you it knows how to breathe. Now, for 9 months, it's been breathing liquid. So it hasn't had any experience of breathing non-liquid, but it instantly knows how to do it. If we have found Jesus, if you're starving and somebody brings you bread, you don't steal the bread off and go and hide in a corner. You say, thank you. If you are dying of thirst and somebody brings you a drink, you say, thank you. When you get your Christmas presents